The winter of 2003 brought more than just snow to the mountains of Oregon. In the wake of my father's suicide, I found myself inheriting both his old Subaru and a portion of his estate. Money that felt heavy with the weight of loss. My mother, struggling with both grief and finances, had decided to sell our family cabin near Mount Bachelor. It was set to go on the market in less than a month, a final farewell to yet another piece of my father's legacy. The cabin had always been our sanctuary, a place where memories lived in every corner. Now, in this liminal space between being our family retreat and becoming someone else's home, it offered me one last chance for solitude. With paperwork pending and rentals suspended, I saw an opportunity to escape. Without much thought, I quit my job, packed my snowboarding gear, and headed up the mountain with my closest companion, my black lab, Midnight. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke greeted us as we arrived. The cabin stood just as I remembered, a two-story haven of wooden beams and large windows, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to touch the gray Oregon sky. The bottom floor housed the living room, a modest kitchen, and a guest bedroom I never used. Upstairs, two more bedrooms flanked a master suite with its own balcony, a perfect vantage point for watching snow fall through the trees. The first 2 days passed in a comfortable blur of routine. During daylight hours, Midnight and I would play in the fresh powder, his black coat a stark contrast against the pristine white snow. I'd spend afternoons on the slopes, letting the rush of snowboarding numb my thoughts. Evenings were for PlayStation games, music, and quiet contemplation on the balcony, where I'd nurse whiskey and cigarettes while watching darkness settle over. The mountain. Our nearest neighbors were two other cabins, both vacant and barely visible through the dense forest about a block away. Beyond that, civilization retreated for nearly a mile in every direction, leaving us wrapped in a cocoon of wilderness and silence. The isolation felt right, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance I needed from the world. But on the third day, something shifted. The snow fell heavily, thick flakes obscuring the world beyond our immediate surroundings. Around midday, while taking Midnight out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the fresh snow circling the cabin. They couldn't have been more than 30 minutes old, given the snowfall's pace. They led away from our cabin and disappeared into the tree line where the pines grew denser, their branches hanging heavy with snow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was staying in one of the neighboring cabins after all, though I hadn't seen any signs of life. But something about those prints felt wrong. They were too deliberate, too purposeful in their circuit around our temporary home. As night fell, the incident with the footprints had almost faded from mind. I was upstairs in the master bedroom, half dozing while some forgotten movie played on the TV, when Midnight's behavior changed. His ears suddenly pricked forward, body tensing in that way dogs do when they sense something humans can't. Before I could react, he bolted downstairs, his nails clicking rapidly against the hardwood. The sound of him pacing downstairs sent chills down my spine. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. After what felt like an eternity, he came charging back upstairs, displaying his familiar need to go out dance. My heart sank. The last thing I wanted was to venture outside, but I couldn't deny him. The air outside felt different, heavier somehow, charged with something I couldn't name. Midnight pulled hard on his leash, trying to drag me toward the same section of trees where I'd seen the footprints earlier. He kept alternating between sniffing along the cabin's wall and looking up toward the roof, his behavior growing increasingly agitated. Finally, he just sat down and stared into the darkness, his body rigid with attention. Back inside, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the roof above. Not the light scampering of a squirrel or raccoon, but heavy, measured steps. 6 distinct footfalls, spaced, like a man's stride, moving across the roof with deliberate purpose. Midnight raced to the balcony door, expectant. Something in me snapped, a combination of false bravado and the need to prove to myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I grabbed my flashlight and coat, stepped out onto the balcony and lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing unusual on the roof. The snow lay undisturbed, betraying no evidence of what I'd heard. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I found myself staring at the surrounding trees, their branches swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. That's when I saw it, and everything in me went cold. Even now, years later, my hands shake as I type this part. In one of the taller pines, perhaps 20 feet from the balcony and slightly above my eye level, crouched what looked like a man. Its body was positioned in an impossible squat between 2 branches, arms extended overhead to grasp the branch above. The posture was all wrong, too still, too controlled, too inhuman. Behind me, Midnight began pacing and letting out small, anxious barks. The figure remained motionless, but I could feel its attention fixed on me with terrible intensity. Every instinct screamed at me not to shine my light directly at it, some primal part of my brain warning that illuminating this thing would make it too real, too present. I retreated backward into the bedroom, pulling Midnight with me, and locked the balcony door. When I finally forced myself to shine the light toward the tree, the figure had vanished. I drew the curtains quickly, but that wasn't the end. The tapping started maybe an hour later, gentle, rhythmic, like fingers against glass, an invitation. It continued relentlessly, and with it came a strange compulsion to open the door. The feeling wasn't quite my own, as if something was trying to plant the idea in my mind, but alongside this foreign urge came another sensation. My father's voice, clear as day, telling me to stay put, to keep the door locked, to wait until dawn. I chose to listen to my dad's voice, clutching Midnight close as the tapping continued. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. When morning came, everything was normal. No footprints, no evidence of our nighttime visitor. The remainder of the week passed without incident, as if whatever had visited us that night had tested our defenses and, finding them solid, moved on. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened, grief, isolation, and trauma playing tricks on my mind, but I can't shake the feeling that on that night, 2 forces were present. Something in the darkness that meant me harm, and my father's spirit, standing guard one last time. In the years since, I've often wondered about the connection between those events. My father's suicide had torn a hole in the world, and something had crawled through it, but so had he, coming back just long enough to protect his son from whatever watches in the pines. Sometimes I think about going back to that cabin, but I know better. Some doors, once opened, are best left closed, and some guardians, having completed their final watch, deserve their rest. Yet on cold nights, when the wind moves through trees, I find myself thinking about that figure in the pine, and wondering, if I had opened that door, would I have found answers about death and what lies beyond? Or would I have learned firsthand what my father's spirit had returned to protect me from? These are questions I'm grateful to leave unanswered, thanks to a father's love that proved stronger than death itself. The faint scent of pipe tobacco still lingered in the corners of the house, even months after my grandfather's passing. It was January 2007 when he finally lost his 2-decade battle with leukemia, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to echo through every room of the Victorian home he and my grandmother had shared for nearly 60 years. I never expected that emptiness would become something else entirely. The house itself was a testament to their life together. A sprawling three-story structure with dark wood trim and creaking floorboards that held countless memories within its walls. Every corner had a story. Every room held whispers of the past, and as I would soon discover, perhaps something more. My grandmother couldn't bear to stay there alone. The house was too big, too full of memories, and too empty all at once. We moved her into Silver Pines assisted living by early spring, leaving the house in a peculiar limbo. That's when my parents approached me with an offer that would change everything. Would I consider moving in to maintain the property for insurance purposes? At 23, the prospect of independence was irresistible. I said yes without hesitation, not knowing I was agreeing to become the keeper of not just a house, but of something far more extraordinary. The first signs appeared shortly after his passing, subtle at first, like whispers you barely catch. The large portrait of him in the living room, the one where he stood proudly in his army uniform from 1945, somehow found its way to the floor. One morning, the hook was still firmly in place, the wire intact. It was as if someone had gently lifted it off and set it down. Then came the photo frames. Every morning, we'd find pictures of him face down on various surfaces, while photographs of other family members remained untouched. I initially dismissed my grandmother's claims about these occurrences. Grief can play tricks on the mind, I thought. But then came the day we brought our family dog Bailey to help with the cleanup. Bailey was a golden retriever with a gentle soul who had shared a special bond with my grandfather. They'd spent countless afternoons together in his basement office, where he'd work on his typewriter while Bailey dozed at his feet. The basement had always been my grandfather's domain. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and the air carried the mingled scents of leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and the oil he used to maintain his beloved 1940s Underwood typewriter. But now, Bailey wouldn't go near it. She stood at the top of the stairs, hackles raised, emitting low growls that seemed completely out of character for her normally peaceful nature. Sometimes she would bark at seemingly nothing, her eyes fixed on a specific point in the empty air. After I moved in, the incidents became more frequent and more personal. Items would vanish, only to reappear in the most unlikely places. I remember clearly the day I bought a new lock set for the back door, a simple brass piece that I placed in the kitchen cupboard. When I went to install it that weekend, it had vanished. After searching every logical place, I finally found it. In the trunk of my uncle's vintage BMW 2002, stored in the garage. My grandfather had always loved that car, often telling stories about how he'd helped my uncle restore it in the 80s. These disappearing acts became almost predictable and strangely comforting. My grandfather had always been known for his practical jokes, like the time he convinced the entire family that he'd spotted a UFO, only to reveal days later that it had been an elaborate setup involving Christmas lights and fishing line. These mysterious occurrences felt like a continuation of his playful spirit. The most regular reminder of his presence came every morning at 5:30 a.m. Throughout his life, my grandfather had been religious about his morning routine. He would wake before dawn, make his way to the kitchen, and turn on the old Philips radio to catch the early news. After I moved in, I'd often wake to the sound of that same radio crackling to life at exactly 5:30 a.m. The dial would be turned to his favorite station, the volume set to the precise level he'd always preferred. Then there was the typewriter. Late at night, when the house was at its quietest, the distinct sound of keys striking paper would drift up from his office. The rhythm was unmistakable, the quick bursts of typing followed by the characteristic ding of the carriage return, exactly as I remembered from my childhood. I never went down to investigate during these nocturnal writing sessions. Something told me that whatever I might find, or not find, would break the spell. I found myself talking to him, sharing my day as I moved through the house. I'd tell him about my job interviews, my dating life, my hopes and fears. Sometimes I'd swear I could feel him listening. A slight change in the air pressure, a faint whiff of pipe tobacco, the subtle creak of floorboards behind me. It wasn't scary. It was comforting, like being wrapped in a warm blanket of memories. But then, about 6 months after I moved in, everything stopped. The radio remained silent at 5:30 a.m. The typing ceased. Objects stayed exactly where I put them. The house felt different, emptier somehow, in a way it hadn't even in the immediate aftermath of his death. For several days, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But the silence grew heavier, more significant. In a moment of desperate hope, I brought Bailey back to the house. She had always been our barometer for his presence, our living ghost detector. When we first arrived, she showed her usual reluctance at the door, but then something changed. She walked in, tail low but wagging slightly, and did something she hadn't done in months. She headed straight for the basement stairs. I followed her down, my heart pounding with each creaking step. The basement air was different now, just musty and old, without that lingering trace of tobacco that had persisted for so long. Bailey walked directly to his office, her nails clicking against the concrete floor. She entered the room and lay down in her old spot next to his desk, but there was something different about her behavior. There was no alertness, no sense of awareness of another presence. She was just a dog lying in a room full of memories. That's when it hit me. He was truly gone. Not just physically gone, as he had been for months, but gone in every sense. Whatever part of him had lingered in the house, watching over us, playing his gentle pranks, keeping his routines, had finally moved on. The realization brought me to my knees, tears flowing freely for the first time since his funeral. I sat there on the office floor, Bailey's head in my lap, surrounded by the artifacts of my grandfather's life. The typewriter, the filing cabinets, the shelf of Reader's Digest condensed books he'd collected over decades. The grief felt fresh and raw, but different this time. The first time we lost him, we lost his physical presence. This time, we were losing something else. The comfort of his lingering spirit, the sense that he was still watching over us, still part of our daily lives. Looking back now, I understand that those 6 months were a gift, a chance to say goodbye gradually, to adjust to his absence in stages rather than all at once. He stayed long enough to help us through the worst of our grief, to remind us that love doesn't simply vanish when someone dies, and then, when we were ready, he moved on. Sometimes, when I visit the house now, I'll catch myself listening for the typewriter or checking the radio at 5:30 a.m. The sounds never come anymore, but I've made peace with that. Whatever happens after we die, whatever, let him stay with us. For those precious extra months, I'm grateful for that final chance to know him, to say goodbye, and to learn that sometimes love is strong enough to linger just a little longer than death.